I'm Renee Evans, and welcome to this video podcast on sources. Today we're going to learn about primary and secondary sources. Often, students are asked to do research using primary and secondary sources. Many come here to the Media Center and then realize they're not quite sure what the difference is between the types of sources. This video podcast will explain these terms and give examples for each category.
Primary sources. What does that mean? Primary sources are usually defined as first-hand information or data that is generated by witnesses or participants in past events. Primary sources are original materials on which other research is based. They are from the time period involved and have not been filtered through interpretation or evaluation. Primary sources present original thinking, report a discovery, or share new information. Primary sources are characterized not by their format, but rather by the information they convey and their relationship to the research question.
For example, if someone is researching Holocaust survivor Gerda Weissman, her personal letters and photographs would be primary sources. So this postcard from her husband, Kurt Klein, as well as his photograph, even though they are photocopied, they are still considered primary sources. So are photographs of her family and documents related to her capture and release. Another example of primary sources are articles from the time period in which she lived. A video interview with Gerda and her husband is also considered a primary source. Even if the documents are digitized, they are still primary sources. Digitizing them just makes them more accessible to all of us today. Each of these items come from the time period involved and have not been filtered through interpretation or evaluation. That is what you, as the researcher, will do. Why should we research using primary sources? People seek out primary sources because they are looking for direct evidence and information in order to better understand objects, people, places, and events from the past. Now, let's review examples of primary sources.
Primary sources may consist of artifacts, for example, coins, plant specimens, fossils, furniture, tools, clothing, all from the time under study. Speeches. These could be audio recordings or written transcripts. Letters or other original documents, birth certificates, wills, marriage license, trial transcripts. Also diary entries, photographs or interviews, oral histories, telephone or email interviews. These are just a few examples of primary sources. Remember, take into account if it is the original work generated by a witness at the time of the event.
Now let's look at secondary sources. Secondary sources are less easily defined than primary sources. The function of secondary sources is to interpret primary sources. You may hear the term tertiary sources. For this assignment, we consider tertiary sources to be secondary because, again, they interpret primary sources.
Generally, secondary sources are accounts written after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. Secondary sources are interpretations and evaluations of primary sources, often defined as one step removed from the event. Secondary sources are not evidence, but rather commentary on and discussion of evidence. They interpret, assign value to, conjecture upon, and draw conclusions about the events reported in primary sources. These are usually in the form of published works, such as journal articles, books, but may also include radio or television programs or conference proceedings.
Examples of secondary sources include biographical works, commentaries, criticisms, textbooks, dictionaries, and encyclopedias. Keep in mind that authors of secondary sources often include a listing of the primary sources they use. You can often check the bibliography of a secondary source to locate valuable primary sources. Now, let's review Secondary sources.
Secondary sources may include biographical works, commentaries or criticisms, dictionaries, encyclopedias, monographs other than fiction and autobiography, or textbooks. All of these sources offer interpretation and evaluation of primary events.
It is important to note that the types of information considered primary sources may vary depending on the subject discipline and also on how you are using the material. For example, a magazine article reporting on recent studies linking the reduction of energy consumption to electric cars would be a secondary source. A research article proving this would be a primary source. Or if you are studying how electric cars are presented in popular media, the magazine article could be considered a primary source. So, how do you determine if you're looking at a primary source or a secondary source?
When evaluating primary or secondary sources, the following 3 questions might be asked to help ascertain the nature and value of material being considered. Number 1. How does the author know these details? Was he or she present at the event? Number 2. Where does this information come from? Personal experience, eyewitness accounts, or reports written by others? Number 3. Are the author's conclusions based on a single piece of evidence, or have many sources been taken into account? All of these questions must be taken into account when one is attempting to arrive at the truth of an event.
Ultimately, all source materials must be assessed critically, and even the most scrupulous and thorough work is viewed through the eyes of the researcher, interpreter, and writer. That's you. The ability to distinguish between primary and secondary source materials is essential. You may pause this podcast and check out the following websites to learn more about sources.